Imagine waking up on a beautiful morning, the kind where sunlight feels like a blessing and the world finally seems quiet. Now imagine stepping outside, onto the lawn you worked your entire life to earn, wearing a shirt that makes you feel proud, dignified, whole, only to feel a cold gun barrel pressed against your temple by a man who swore an oath to protect you. Not because you committed a crime, not because you posed a threat, but because in his eyes your very existence was the crime. This is the moment where a peaceful morning becomes a nightmare. It's the moment when a black man, a respected American judge, was treated as less than human, humiliated, mocked, threatened, on his own front lawn. And what happened next? What unfolded in the next 12 minutes would shake an entire police department, ignite a national firestorm, and expose a level of corruption so deep that even the officers involved couldn't escape it. But here's the truth this story reveals. A single moment of courage can unravel years of abuse. One witness can change history. And the quiet dignity of one man can bring an entire corrupt system to its knees. If you think you know how far racism can reach, you haven't heard this story yet. And if you believe justice is only a word, watch what happens when justice finally stands up for itself. This is one of the most shocking, heartbreaking, and empowering true stories you will ever hear on this channel. So before we begin, hit subscribe to Racist Reality, because these stories matter, these truths matter, and together we shine a light on the injustice so many try to hide. Now take a breath, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after the video ends. Let's begin. A new home, an old hate. The morning sunlight over Maple Ridge Drive in Lakewood Heights looked almost unreal in its perfection. It washed over the wide, quiet street with a soft, golden glow that made everything seem calm, orderly, and untouched by the world's troubles. It was the kind of neighborhood where people spoke in gentle voices, where children rode bicycles without fear, and where the lawns looked as if they had been trimmed by the hands of angels. A place where silence didn't just exist, it ruled. But the silence on this particular Saturday morning was more than peaceful. It was restrictive. It was curated. And for the residents who had lived here the longest, it was the kind of silence they believed needed protection. To them, Maple Ridge Drive was perfect because everyone who lived here looked the same, thought the same, behaved the same, and in places like this, still scattered like hidden relics across America, that sameness was never accidental. It was enforced, quietly, subtly, relentlessly. Officer Mark Rogers, 39 years old, believed he was the enforcer of that sameness. After 15 years patrolling Lakewood Heights, he didn't just see himself as a police officer. He saw himself as a guardrail, a gatekeeper between what he called order and what he called threats. In his mind, threats didn't always come with guns or masks. Sometimes they came wearing silk shirts and brown skin. As he drove slowly through the neighborhood in his patrol car, though no crime had ever truly occurred on the Maple Ridge, he felt an ownership of the place that rivaled the residents, maybe even surpassed it. He believed he understood what the community needed more than the people who lived here. He believed he could sense disruption from a mile away. And that was when he saw him. Standing in the yard of the recently sold Harrington estate was a tall black man, about mid-50s, composed, dignified, admiring, of all things, a small Japanese maple he had planted the day before. The tree, with its burgundy leaves shimmering in the sunlight, mirrored the crimson embroidery on his cream silk shirt. This was Judge Anthony Walker, 56 years old, the first black Chief Justice in the history of the state's Supreme Court. A man who had clawed his way up through institutions that had never wanted him there. A man who had defended civil rights cases long before he had the power to shape the law itself. A man who had earned everything he had through brilliance, discipline, and resilience. But to Mark Rogers, none of that mattered. He didn't know who the man was, and even if he did, it wouldn't have mattered. All he saw was a black man standing comfortably in a yard that, in his mind, should not belong to someone like him. Rogers' patrol car screeched to a needless, aggressive stop. The sound sliced through the quiet suburban air like a blade. Birds scattered from nearby branches. Curtains shifted behind tinted windows. A dog barked twice before its owner shushed it. Judge Walker turned at the sound, his calm expression shifting into one of polite curiosity. He hadn't been expecting visitors. Not today, not this early, and certainly not from a police officer stomping his way out of a cruiser with the kind of entitled swagger that telegraphed trouble long before words were exchanged. The officer left his car door open, a tactic he had mastered as a subtle message. I'm in control here. I decide when this ends. His hand rested lightly on his holstered weapon. Morning, Rogers said, voice clipped, cold, unfriendly. The kind of greeting that wasn't really a greeting at all. Good morning, officer, Judge Walker replied, his tone warm but measured. Is something wrong? Rogers' eyes lingered on the judge's shirt. The fine silk, the elegant embroidery, the quiet sophistication that radiated both luxury and self-respect. It irritated him, the way confidence often irritates those who feel small inside. Fancy shirt for yard work, Rogers said with a faint sneer. You the new gardener? Judge Walker's smile was polite, but behind it a lifetime of tiring encounters flickered, a lifetime of assumptions, of being misjudged, underestimated, diminished. No, he replied calmly. I'm the new owner of this home. Rogers let out a short, dismissive laugh. Right, and I'm the president. He took a step closer. Let's see some ID. Proof you belong here. Judge Walker breathed in slowly, letting patience settle over him the way it had so many times before. He did not raise his voice. He did not match hostility with hostility. Officer, he said gently, I am standing on my own property. I am not required to show identification unless I am engaged in criminal activity, which I am not. Rogers' expression tightened, irritation, then anger, then something uglier. Authority in his eyes was being challenged, not by a criminal, not by a threat, but by a black man who dared to stand firm while wearing a shirt that belonged to people he believed lived elsewhere. You a lawyer or something? Judge Walker only inclined his head. Something like that. Across the street, Emily Carter, 32 years old, watched the exchange from behind her curtain. She didn't understand the full legal context, but she recognized danger instantly. She saw the officer's hand gripping the holster. She saw the tension in the black man's shoulders, and she saw the look in his eyes. Not fear, but disappointment, the look of someone who had been here before. Emily hesitated. She didn't know what to do. She had always believed Lakewood Heights was safe, peaceful, fair, but something about this moment felt wrong. And the wrongness felt so heavy that she impulsively grabbed her phone. Back in the yard, Rogers took another step forward. I'm going to ask you one more time, he growled. Show me some ID. And I'm going to tell you one more time, the judge answered softly, that I am not required to do so. That was the moment, the breaking point, the snap of the thin thread holding Rogers' restraint. In a flash of rage, he unclipped his holster. The sound was sharp, chilling, unmistakable. Judge Walker knew the sound intimately, not as a victim, but as a legal scholar. He had read hundreds of case files describing that exact sound right before tragedy. But hearing it directed at his own skull, on the lawn he had bought with a lifetime of sacrifice, was different. Rogers pulled his gun, pressed it hard against Anthony's temple. Time froze. The world fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Emily gasped, covering her mouth, her phone trembling. Judge Walker remained still, unbroken. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, but his face stayed calm, dignified. Inside him, a different kind of pain churned. Not fear of dying, but the pain of knowing that after all his accomplishments, all his progress, all his battles for equality, this was still how he could be treated. Like a threat, like a trespasser, like a man who didn't belong in the home he had earned. Rogers spat. Who knows the law now, huh? I could end you right here. Fear for my life. That's all it takes. Judge Walker looked him dead in the eye through the reflection of his sunglasses and whispered, You will regret this for the rest of your life. It wasn't a threat. It was a prophecy. One born from pain, one born from truth, one born from the quiet strength of a man who refused to bend, even with a gun pressed against his skull. The gun at his temple. The cold steel pressed against Judge Anthony Walker's temple felt impossibly heavy, Not physically, but spiritually. It wasn't the weight of the gun alone. It was the weight of centuries behind it. The weight of a country that had promised equality in its laws, but had not always reflected that promise in its streets. The weight of every black man who had ever been told he didn't belong, even when standing on land he owned, in a home he earned, in a life he built with his own mind and sweat. For a moment, that entire history lay in the space between the gun and his skin. Officer Mark Rogers stood so close that Anthony could feel each hot breath hit the side of his face. Ragged, angry, shallow. Rage doesn't breathe deeply. It pantles like a cornered animal mistaking its own fear for dominance. Rogers' hand trembled, not with fear, but with adrenaline, with the twisted excitement of power misused. In the reflection of his own sunglasses, Judge Walker saw the distorted image of the officer's face, red, tight, trembling with the kind of hatred that lights itself on fire just to burn someone else. The street was silent, cars unmoving, children suddenly still. Maple Ridge Drive, this perfectly cut slice of suburbia, had become something else entirely. A stage, a reckoning. Across the street, Emily Carter pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. She had seen viral videos before, moments where something terrible happens to someone who looks like they don't deserve it, and the world debates after it's too late to help. But she had never imagined she'd witness it outside her own living room window. Her phone shook in her grasp, but she kept recording, because instinct told her what fear did not. If she stopped recording, he might die. Back in the yard, Judge Walker's voice was calm in a way that defied logic, calm in a way that made Rogers' rage swell even larger. "You will regret this for the rest of your life." Rogers' jaw twitched. The words stung, not because they were loud or threatening, but because they were quietly true. Somewhere deep inside him, in a place he rarely visited, Rogers felt a momentary flicker of uncertainty. But ego is louder than conscience. "Oh yeah?" he hissed. "I'll regret it. You think that? You think just because you talk fancy, you're safe?" He pressed the muzzle harder into Anthony's temple, the skin denting beneath the barrel. "I am the law here," Rogers growled. "I could end this right now. All I have to say is the magic phrase, 'feared for my life.' That's all it takes. You think anyone's going to question it? You think anyone here is going to stand up for you?" He wasn't just taunting. He was revealing the truth of the system he had grown comfortable abusing. He was exposing the lie behind the badge he wore. Judge Walker knew that, and he also knew something Rogers didn't. A system that protects corruption cannot protect itself forever. "Officer," he said, his tone low but razor sharp, "you are creating danger where none exists. That is the very definition of abuse of authority." Rogers bared his teeth in a twisted smile. "You people," he spat, "always trying to flip it around, always thinking you're special. You walk into places like this and think the rules don't apply to you. You people." Two words that cut deeper than the muzzle did. The phrase was a key unlocking the truth of Rogers' worldview. In that moment, Rogers wasn't speaking to Judge Anthony Walker, the state's Chief Justice. He wasn't speaking to a man. He was speaking to a symbol. Everything he feared, resented, and believed he needed to control. Judge Walker breathed in slowly, feeling the crisp morning air fill his lungs, steadying him. His father used to tell him that dignity is not something the world gives you. It's something you carry, even when the world tries to tear it off your back. Especially then. He stood straighter. He did not blink. He did not break. Across the street, the curtain shifted again. Mr. Whitman, retired engineer and self-declared guardian of the neighborhood standard, watched with folded arms, nodding with quiet approval. In his mind, order was finally being restored. The neighborhood would be safe again. He closed his blinds with the satisfied finality of a man who believed justice was being served. He had no idea how wrong he was. Inside her home, Emily's palms were sweating so much she nearly dropped her phone. She could barely swallow. Her mind raced with words she wanted to scream out the window. "Put the gun down! He lives there! Stop!" But fear held her tongue hostage. Fear that if she intervened, the gun might swivel toward her, or worse, toward her toddler in the next room. So she did the only thing she felt she could. She kept recording and praying. Officer Rogers leaned in, his voice a poisonous whisper so close that Anthony could smell the bitterness of stale coffee clinging to his breath. "Last chance," Rogers said. "ID, on the ground, now." Judge Walker's heartbeat was steady. His voice was steady. His pride, iron. "You have no legal basis for this demand." That was it. The exact sentence Rogers could not tolerate. Not because it was wrong, because it was right. Rogers' rage boiled over. With a swift, violent motion, he grabbed Judge Walker's wrist and spun him around, wrenching his arm behind his back. The gun stayed pressed to the side of his head as Rogers forced him downward. "Get on the ground," he shouted. Judge Walker didn't resist, because resistance was what Rogers wanted. Resistance would give him the justification he desperately needed. That was the cruelest part of the dance. The officer created danger and then reacted to the danger he invented. Rogers shouted again, louder this time, for the benefit of any invisible audience. "Stop resisting." But Anthony wasn't resisting. He was simply existing in a space that Rogers believed he did not belong. The humiliation cut deeper than the strain on his arms, deeper than the pressure on his temple, deeper than the bruise blooming beneath his ribs where Rogers' knee pinned him. Because Judge Anthony Walker, who had defended innocence, preserved justice, and upheld the law for decades, was being treated like a criminal in the yard he purchased with a lifetime of labor and sacrifice. He thought of the cases he had presided over. He thought of the rulings he had made. He thought of every time he had believed, deep down, perhaps naively, that the system could be repaired through patience and principle. Yet here he was, face pressed into the grass, a gun at his head, being told he didn't belong. For all his titles, his accomplishments, his honors, his skin was still a weapon others projected their fear onto. Rogers finally holstered his gun and replaced its cold steel with the colder bite of handcuffs. The click of metal closing around Judge Walker's wrists echoed across the pristine lawn, a sound that felt like an insult, a sound that, to him, represented every time America had said, "No matter what you accomplish, you are still less than." As Rogers yanked him to his feet, a sharp pain shot up Anthony's shoulder, but he didn't wince. He refused to give the officer that satisfaction. "You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting," Rogers announced loudly, savoring each syllable. Judge Walker met his eyes with a calmness that both unnerved and enraged the officer. "This is unlawful," he said, "and you know it." Rogers shoved him toward the patrol car. "Save it for court," he sneered, "assuming you make it that far." Emily nearly choked on her own breath. What did that mean? Was he threatening him? Her camera stayed steady. She felt something rise inside her, something unfamiliar but powerful. Anger, disgust, a moral scream trying to break out of her chest. Rogers opened the back door of the cruiser and slammed Anthony's head against the doorframe with deliberate force. "Watch your head," he mocked. Pain flashed through Anthony's skull, bright, white, and humiliating. He tasted blood. But even now, even bruised and bleeding, he refused to bow his head. He sat upright in the cramped, plastic-smelling back seat, breathing in deeply, not because he was calm, but because he understood something. This moment was no longer just about him. He thought about the thousands of black men brought into precincts like this one, without the shield of a title or the support of powerful friends. Men who had suffered without witnesses, without cameras, without justice. Men whose stories were buried in silence. He inhaled the bitterness of the moment and turned it into resolve. Because this wasn't just an arrest, this was evidence. Evidence of a system that needed to be confronted, exposed, and rebuilt. In the reflection of the cruiser window, Judge Walker saw Emily lower her phone. She looked terrified, but she also looked determined. And in that split second, despite the pain, despite the humiliation, despite the fear that Rogers might escalate further, Judge Walker felt something unexpected. Hope. Because one woman had pressed record. Because one woman refused to look away. Because one woman believed that truth mattered more than comfort. The car pulled away from the curb, the house shrinking behind them, the Japanese maple's red leaves flickering like a silent witness. And as they turned the corner onto the main road, Judge Walker closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." Paraded like a criminal, The patrol car door slammed shut on Judge Anthony Walker with a violent thud, swallowing him into the stale plastic darkness of the back seat, a space built not for comfort, but for containment. The reinforced glass that separated him from the world outside distorted the view like a cracked lens, refracting the quiet, manicured perfection of Maple Ridge Drive into something unfamiliar and cruel. Officer Mark Rogers walked around the cruiser with a swagger that had returned now that the gun was holstered and the handcuffs were tight. His boots crunched on the driveway gravel, each step slow, theatrical, purposeful. He wanted everyone watching to see the show, and the neighborhood was watching. Behind curtains, through blinds, from porches, eyes tracked every moment. Some eyes were wide with fear, others narrowed with judgment, but almost all were silent. Silence, Judge Walker had long ago learned, is rarely neutral. Silence has a side. Rogers jerked open the driver's door, slid inside, and adjusted his mirror so he could stare directly at Anthony through the reinforced glass. The look he gave wasn't professional. It wasn't procedural. It was personal. A sneer curled on his lips as if he had accomplished something profound, something righteous. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. He said into the radio with the smooth ease of a man who'd rehearsed lies many times before. "I've got one black male in custody. Matches the description of our burglary suspect. Bringing him in now." A lie crafted effortlessly. A lie that would become part of the official record. A lie that could have ended a man's life if not for a camera in a neighbor's window. Judge Walker felt a cold wave of understanding wash over him. How many others had been dragged into cars like this? How many had been given made-up reasons to justify someone else's prejudice? How many had been erased in silence? Outside, the houses glowed in morning sunlight, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that their tranquility had been purchased at the cost of tolerance, empathy, or truth. As Rogers pulled away from the curb, the car crept slowly, deliberately slowly, down Maple Ridge Drive. There was no need for caution, no pedestrians, no traffic, no emergency to hurry toward. But Rogers wanted time, time for others to look, time to display his catch, time to drag humiliation across the asphalt like a trophy. A couple walking their golden retriever slowed their pace as the cruiser rolled by. The woman frowned, confused. The man offered a stiff nod to Rogers, a nod that said, "You're doing the right thing. Protecting us." Emily Carter remained at her window, phone in hand, breath held. Her heart hadn't stopped racing since the moment she saw the gun pressed to Anthony's head. She had recorded everything, every insult, every threat, every escalation. She didn't know yet if she'd be brave enough to show the world, but she knew she couldn't delete it. Her husband stepped into the room and whispered urgently, "Emily, stop recording. Please, this isn't our fight." Her eyes stayed fixed on the cruiser, on the man inside who held himself with regal composure, even as chains bruised his wrists. "Maybe that's the problem," she whispered. "It should be." But she said nothing else. Fear still lived in her chest, sharing space with the anger. Inside the cruiser, Rogers hummed an off-key tune, a lazy, tuneless rhythm that felt like mockery itself. His fingers drummed on the steering wheel. His eyes flicked occasionally to the mirror to ensure he met Anthony's gaze. "You know," Rogers said casually, "a house like yours, it brings down property values, changes the feel of the whole neighborhood." Anthony didn't respond. Silence became his shield. Rogers continued, clearly annoyed by the judge's calm. "You people always think because you get a nice job, a fancy car, and a shiny house, you belong in places like this." Anthony lifted his chin. His wrists burned from the cuffs, but he refused to let his dignity bend. The officer's words were meant to penetrate, to erode his sense of self, but they hit the wall of a lifetime spent battling more sophisticated forms of the same hatred. The drive stretched on like an endless parade of humiliation. Every moment, every corner, every suspicious glance from passers-by burned a fresh layer of pain into Anthony's memory. Not because he feared the legal consequences. He knew the law better than the man driving him ever would. But because the public shame cut deeper than private violence. A child in a front yard paused mid-scooter ride to stare at the black man behind glass like an exotic creature in captivity. His mother quickly scooped him up and carried him inside, as though proximity alone posed danger. Anthony felt something inside him tighten, an ache deeper than humiliation, sharper than anger. This was what he had spent his life fighting against. The notion that blackness was a warning sign, a threat, a reason for fear. When they arrived at the precinct, a squat gray building that looked like it had been designed to drain hope out of people, Rogers threw the cruiser into park and climbed out. He yanked the back door open and grabbed Anthony's arm with unnecessary force. "Let's go," he growled. "Let everyone get a good look." He didn't pull Anthony out quickly. He dragged him, slowly, deliberately, performing. The pavement was hot under Anthony's shoes as they crossed the parking lot. The sun beat down hard, but the sting on his wrist was sharper than any heat. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered with that faint hum that seemed to vibrate in tune with tension. A bored desk sergeant didn't even look up from his newspaper as they passed. In the booking area, Rogers shoved Anthony onto a hard plastic bench. "Empty your pockets," he ordered. Judge Walker raised his cuffed hands slightly. "That may be difficult," he said, voice even, "given your restraints." Rogers' face darkened at the quiet defiance. "I'll do it," he snapped, "since you're so helpless." A second officer, a young man with uncertain eyes, approached. Officer Jason Wells, 27. The idealism wasn't quite gone from his face, but it was fading under the weight of survival inside a corrupt department. He patted Anthony down, pulled out a wallet, opened it. His breath caught. He saw the gold emblem, the seal, the ID. He froze. He looked up at the man sitting calmly on the bench, then back at the ID. Chief Justice Anthony Walker. The title alone had gravity, but the reality, the injustice, hit Jason like a blow to the chest. He swallowed hard. His hands shook. He looked toward Rogers, who was too busy enjoying his performance to notice. "What's in there?" Rogers asked impatiently. "Stolen credit card? A baggie? What did he have?" Jason's voice cracked. "Mark, you need to see this." Rogers snatched the wallet from Jason's hand with a smirk, until he saw the badge. The smirk evaporated. Shock flooded his face, followed by fear, followed by something even darker, pride resisting collapse. "That's fake," Rogers snapped. "He probably ordered it online. Criminals get creative." Jason looked horrified. "No one fakes a Supreme Court Justice ID, Mark." Judge Walker watched the unraveling, not with triumph, but with a calm, heavy sorrow. This entire system, he realized, wasn't broken by accident. It had been built with cracks woven into its foundation. In that moment, his humiliation transformed into something steadier, firmer, more powerful. Resolve. Rogers, too stubborn to back down, continued to lie, piling fiction atop fiction, like a man trying to stop a flood with a handful of sand. "He trespassed," Rogers insisted. "Resisted arrest. He assaulted me." Jason flinched. Even the walls seemed tired of the lies. As the chaos simmered in the room, Judge Walker lifted his head and looked around. He saw fear on Jason's face, indifference on the sergeant's, the brittle arrogance of Rogers, the corruption settling like dust. This was the system that had just tried to crush him. This was the system that had crushed thousands before him, and this was the system he would now dismantle, piece by piece. The humiliation he felt wasn't diminished by his status. It wasn't mitigated by his power. It wasn't eased by the knowledge that revenge or justice might soon come. Because the pain of racism is not a legal problem. It is a human one, a wound that slices into the soul long before it reaches the law. As he sat there, his wrists marked with red grooves, blood dried at the corner of his lip, silk shirt rumpled and stained, he felt the full weight of what had been done. And yet, beneath that pain, there was fire, quiet, steady, unbreakable, the kind of fire that starts revolutions. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about every neighbor who stayed silent, every officer who looked away, every victim who never got a headline, every child who grew up thinking dignity was conditional. Judge Anthony Walker had been paraded like a criminal, but he knew something the men around him did not. The world was about to learn who the real criminals were. The judge in chains. The fluorescent lights in the Lakewood Heights precinct buzzed faintly above Judge Anthony Walker, turning the room into a cold, artificial landscape. It smelled of disinfectant and fatigue, old walls holding secrets they could not confess, desks covered in the residue of quiet corruption. Anthony sat on the hard plastic bench, his wrists cuffed, the metal biting deep into the skin. His elegant silk shirt, once a symbol of pride, accomplishment, and culture, was now rumpled, stained, torn at the shoulder where Officer Mark Rogers had yanked him through the patrol car door. He looked smaller, sitting there in the shadow of institutional machinery. But the look in his eyes was not small. It was sharp, steady, and full of a defiant dignity that refused to wither, even under fluorescent humiliation. Officer Jason Wells stood only a few feet away. His hands still trembled from what he had seen in the wallet. The impossible truth of who the department had just arrested under false pretenses. Chief Justice, not a lawyer, not a professor, not an uppity man in a silk shirt, as Rogers had sneered earlier. A Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, a man sworn to uphold the very laws Rogers had just trampled over. Jason swallowed hard. His conscience vibrated like a struck tuning fork. He had wanted to believe in this department. He had wanted to believe that the stories he'd heard, the rumors about racism, intimidation, and unethical behavior, were exaggerations, anomalies, misunderstandings. But the truth did not whisper this time. It screamed. He had watched a man be assaulted, humiliated, and dragged like an animal. And now he knew the man was one of the highest legal authorities in the state. If the department could do this to a Chief Justice, what had they been doing to people with no protection at all? The room felt heavy with truth. Rogers paced back and forth like a caged wolf, muttering curses under his breath, glancing at Jason with growing irritation. The realization of who he had arrested was sinking into him like poison. But instead of remorse, his pride reared up, frantic and desperate. He couldn't be wrong. He couldn't have made a mistake. Because mistakes meant consequences, and consequences meant accountability. And accountability was something a man like Rogers had never faced in his entire career. Jason watched him stop suddenly and slam his hands on the counter. "This is fake," Rogers barked. "I said it's fake, damn it." The desk sergeant finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. "A fake?" he repeated calmly. "Who'd fake a Supreme Court ID?" "A criminal," Rogers snapped back. "They fake everything these days." Jason flinched. He knew this was beyond fabrication. It was a full meltdown, and a dangerous one. He stepped forward cautiously. "Mark, you arrested him for walking in his own yard." Rogers spun on him. "Shut your mouth." Jason clenched his jaw. "This is wrong," he whispered. Not loud, but loud enough. Wrong. The word lingered in the air, thick, undeniable. Before Rogers could respond, the door to the chief's office slammed open. Chief Robert Kane, 61, stepped out with a scowl etched across his broad, ruddy face, his uniform stretched tight around his gut, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He carried himself with the swagger of a man who had built his own private kingdom inside this precinct. "What's all the noise?" and Kane grumbled. "Mark, if you brought me another one of your suspects who turns out to be a drunk landscaper again." He stopped when he saw Judge Walker. His gaze dropped to the ID lying on the counter, then up at Jason, then at Rogers. And he laughed. Not amused laughter, not relieved laughter, but the cruel, dismissive chuckle of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Well," Kane said slowly, "that's creative. A Supreme Court justice. That's a new one." He tossed the ID onto the counter like trash. Judge Walker lifted his head. His voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it carried the weight of law in every measured syllable. "Chief Kane, I would like my phone call." Kane's smile widened. "Oh, we're doing the full routine, huh? Sure, after we finish processing you, which might take a while." He leaned closer, his breath sour with coffee and arrogance. "You're in my house now, and in my house I decide when you get to make a call." Jason Wells felt something inside him twist. Fear, disgust, shame, all bound together in a sickening knot. Judge Walker nodded once, slowly. "Very well," he said. "Your refusal is now noted." Kane blinked. "Noted? What the hell does that mean?" It means, Judge Walker continued, that you are now in violation of departmental procedure and federal law. Rogers rolled his eyes. Oh, here we go. You think saying federal law scares us? But Kane wasn't rolling his eyes. He was watching Judge Walker carefully, too carefully. As an officer of the court, Judge Walker said, sitting straighter despite the cuffs, I am informing you that your actions constitute unlawful detainment, obstruction, and violation of civil rights under color of law. Color of law. The phrase hit the room like a dropped hammer. Kane's jaw tensed. Rogers stiffened. Even the desk sergeant shifted uncomfortably. This is your last opportunity, Judge Walker continued, his eyes never leaving Kane's. Grant me my phone call, or I will ensure that every officer involved faces federal investigation and prosecution. Silence. Not the silence of Maple Ridge Drive. Not the silence of privilege. This was the silence that comes when truth exposes rot. Kane cracked first. He snapped at Wells. Give him the damn phone call. Jason scrambled to comply, unlocking the chain on Judge Walker's cuffs with trembling hands. The metal clattered to the floor, sounding far louder than it should have. Judge Walker stood slowly, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness. Jason's voice dropped to a whisper. I'm sorry, sir. The judge looked at him, not with scorn, but with quiet gratitude that made Jason's throat tighten. You still have a choice, Anthony said softly, and that matters. Kane grumbled from behind them. Phone's on the wall. Make it quick. Judge Walker stepped to the phone, lifted the receiver, and dialed a number from memory. He didn't call his wife. He didn't call a lawyer. He called someone far more powerful. This is Justice Walker, he said clearly when the line clicked. I have been unlawfully detained by the Lakewood Heights Police Department. Contact Attorney General Ramirez immediately. Tell him to bring everyone. For a moment after he hung up, the room held its breath. Then he turned around. Calm, steady, in control. Not a victim, not a prisoner. A judge preparing to judge the system that judged him. Behind him, Rogers attempted to regain his swagger. This won't go anywhere, he muttered. Nobody's gonna... But the words died in his throat as a strange tension began to flood the air. A shift, a sense that something enormous had just been set in motion. Judge Walker sat back down, now liberated from the cuffs, but not yet from the room. He folded his hands in his lap and observed, silent, calculating. Jason returned a moment later with a small paper cup of water. Here, he said quietly. As he pulled his hand away, he whispered, voice trembling, the camera's in the back hallway. The audio doesn't work, hasn't worked for months. A warning, a risk, a choice. Judge Walker's eyes softened. Thank you, he said. And Jason Wells, a young man who had joined the force to protect and serve, but had found himself in the shadow of something darker, felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost. Integrity. Meanwhile, across town, Emily Carter stood in her kitchen staring at her phone. She had replayed the video over and over, each viewing tightening the knot in her stomach. Her hands shook. Her breath trembled. Her husband pleaded with her to delete it. Emily, he whispered fiercely, this could ruin our lives, our safety. His department, they retaliate. You know they do. Please, just stay out of it. Emily's eyes filled with tears, not because she doubted the danger, but because she doubted herself. Yet when she thought of Judge Walker, standing dignified with a gun to his head, something inside her shifted. She couldn't unsee it. She couldn't unknow it. She couldn't pretend it didn't matter. She picked up her phone, her pulse thundering, and dialed the number of Grace Chen, the investigative reporter known for exposing corruption. Hi, Emily whispered. You don't know me, but I have a video you need to see. Back at the precinct, Judge Walker sat in silence. He felt no triumph, no relief, just a quiet, heavy certainty. The storm was coming, and this time it would not break on him. It would break on those who had forgotten what justice was meant to protect. His wrists still ached, his lips still stung, but his resolve was stronger than ever. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been profiled, everyone who had ever been treated as less. and he had no intention of leaving that bench until every part of this corrupt machine was exposed. Judge Anthony Walker sat there in that ugly, buzzing room, not as a man waiting for rescue, but as a judge waiting for the truth to arrive. And when it did, the walls of Lakewood Heights would never look the same again. The law strikes back. The Lakewood Heights Police Precinct felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because something invisible had shifted. A tremor of unease rippled through the air like heat off asphalt. Something heavy and unstoppable was coming, and everyone sensed it except the man who feared it most. Officer Mark Rogers paced the booking area, trying to reclaim his dominance. His boots thudded with forced confidence, but every so often his eyes flicked toward Judge Walker, sitting calmly on the bench, and the mask would slip. Rogers was a man who survived intimidation, but intimidation only worked when the other person accepted fear. And the sight of a man who refused to break, that frightened Rogers more than any threat of punishment. Judge Anthony Walker leaned back lightly against the wall, not relaxed but centered. There was stillness to him now, a certainty, the kind of quiet strength that comes from knowing the truth is finally on your side. He had made the call. The Attorney General's office had been alerted, and now all he had to do was wait. Chief Robert Kane emerged from his office again, wiping crumbs from his uniform. His attempt to look in control was betrayed by the frantic tapping of his fingers on the doorframe. He glanced at Judge Walker, then at the ID on the counter, then back at Rogers. His jaw twitched. "How long ago did you make that call?" Kane demanded. Judge Walker looked at the clock. "Approximately 30 minutes. Kane snorted. "They won't rush here for this nonsense." But even as he said it, a faint worry leaked into his voice. Judge Walker didn't respond. He didn't need to. A storm doesn't announce itself. It arrives. The arrival, 45 minutes after the phone call, the precinct entrance burst open, not dramatically, but with precise, confident force. A woman in a tailored charcoal suit strode in, as if she owned the building. Deputy Attorney General Lisa Chen, 45, sharp as a blade, flanked by two federal investigators in black suits. Her heels clicked with rhythmic finality across the tile. The desk sergeant stood abruptly. "Can I help you?" "Yes," she said crisply. "I'm here for Chief Justice Anthony Walker." Her voice filled the room with unarguable authority. Every officer froze. Every breath paused. Kane stumbled forward, adjusting his belt. "Now hold on," he sputtered. "This is our jurisdiction. We've got procedures." Lisa cut him off with a single look so fierce it carved silence into the room. "You have exactly 30 seconds, she said, "to release Judge Walker from custody and hand me a copy of the complete, unedited arrest documentation." Rogers blanched. Kane's mouth opened and closed like a fish hauled onto a dock. Lisa stepped closer, her eyes locked onto Kane's. "You did not arrest a suspect," she said, her voice cold and precise. "You assaulted and abducted a sitting Chief Justice. What you are running here is not an investigation. It is a federal crime." She took another step forward. "And I will personally ensure every officer involved is held accountable." Kane's face was drained of color. The facade had shattered. His kingdom was collapsing. He swung toward Jason Wells. "Get the keys," he barked, voice cracking. Jason practically ran to Judge Walker, unlocking the cuffs with trembling urgency. When the metal fell away, Judge Walker rubbed his wrist gently, the red grooves stark against his skin. Lisa approached him. "Justice Walker, are you injured?" "A split lip," he answered. "Nothing more." But his tone carried something deeper, something resolute. He turned to face Kane and Rogers for the first time since the call. The look in his eyes was not anger, not revenge. It was the look of a judge who has seen enough, who understands the gravity of what he is about to do, and the responsibility it carries. "The harm done to me will heal," he said, voice steady. "But the harm done to the law today, that will require a far greater remedy." Rogers swallowed hard. Kane stepped back involuntarily, because they finally understood. The man they had tried to break was the one man in the state they could least afford to cross, and they had crossed him fully. The War Room. 2 hours later, Judge Walker's study looked nothing like it had that morning when he stood admiring his Japanese maple. Now it was the strategic center of a battle far greater than one arrest. The mahogany desk was covered in legal pads, laptops, files, and freshly written notes. The air held the quiet intensity of people who understood the stakes and refused to flinch. Judge Walker now wore a dark, crisp suit, his silk shirt replaced but not forgotten. The bruise at his lip was faint but visible, a reminder of the morning's violence. Across from him sat the three people he trusted most for this kind of fight. Deputy Attorney General Lisa Chen. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, drafting subpoenas and formal complaints with surgical precision. Investigative reporter Grace Chen, Lisa's younger sister, notebook open, scribbling nonstop. She had already spoken to Emily Carter, the terrified neighbor who held the key to exposing everything. Private investigator Darius Reed, a former FBI agent with a rare ability to unearth secrets people thought they had buried in concrete. He sat quietly in the corner, reviewing records on a tablet. Judge Walker surveyed them with calm, controlled purpose. "Let's begin," he said. Grace spoke first. "Emily Carter filmed everything," she said. "All of it. From the moment Rogers stopped you to the moment he shoved you into the car, and the audio is crystal clear." Lisa stopped typing. "That video alone will change everything." Grace nodded. "And she's willing to hand over the original file. She's scared, but she's brave." And Anthony closed his eyes for half a second. In that moment, he felt gratitude. A deep, aching gratitude for a woman he didn't even know. Courage is never small. Sometimes it appears in the quietest of people. "Good," he said. "She is a key witness. Make sure she is protected." Darius slid his tablet toward the judge. "I've started digging," he said. "Officer Mark Rogers has 12 civilian complaints over 10 years, all dismissed internally. Excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation. It's a pattern." He swiped again. "And Chief Robert Kane? Even worse. Off-the-books contracts with a private security company he co-owns. Evidence disappearing from the locker, always tied to wealthy families. This is systemic." Judge Walker nodded. His gaze hardened. "This isn't about one cop," he said quietly. "It's a culture, a system built on fear, power, and silence. We're not just cutting off the head of the snake, we're removing the nest." Lisa looked up. "I filed the initial civil rights complaint. Federal investigators will arrive within 48 hours. Grace tapped her pen. "Do we release the video now?" Darius answered first. "Not yet. Let the legal machinery move into place. When the video drops, it will detonate the entire structure." Judge Walker leaned back slightly, exhaling. Humiliation had been his morning, but now he had a purpose. With this team, with this truth, with this evidence, he could transform pain into justice. A quiet moment. For a brief moment, the room fell silent. The ticking of the clock echoed against the bookshelves. Judge Walker looked down at his hands that were still slightly red from the cuffs. He thought about the thousands of men who had sat where he sat today. Men without cameras, men without connections, men without teams or attorneys or power. Men who had simply gone quietly into the belly of a system designed to break them. He felt sorrow. He felt anger. He felt responsibility. "I wasn't just arrested today," he said softly. "I was given a mandate." The others looked at him. To fight, not just for myself, but for all the people who didn't have a witness, didn't have a voice, didn't have someone coming to rescue them. He stood slowly, placing a hand on the table. "This is not revenge," he said. "This is restoration. Of truth, of justice, of dignity." He looked at his team, 3 people of different backgrounds united by principle. "It's time," he said. "Let's begin." The trap for Officer Rogers. Officer Mark Rogers had always believed that power protected him. Power came with the badge. Power came with the silent approval of his department. Power came with the quiet nods of certain neighbors who preferred order over fairness, silence over truth. And when people like Mark carry power long enough, without consequence, they begin to mistake it for invincibility. For the first 24 hours after Judge Walker's release, Rogers clung desperately to that illusion. He told himself the investigation wouldn't stick. He told himself his chief wouldn't let him fall. He told himself he just needed to control the narrative. But beneath the bravado lived a small, trembling fear, a fear that woke him up at night drenched in sweat. a fear that repeated the same 8 words in the back of his mind like a curse he couldn't banish. You will regret this for the rest of your life. Rogers had laughed at that line when he first heard it, but now every time he closed his eyes, he saw Judge Walker's calm, steady gaze. Not angry, not afraid, just certain. And certainty is a powerful thing. So when Chief Kane pulled him into his office the next morning, Rogers felt both hopeful and terrified. Kane shut the door behind them with a heavy thud. Internal Affairs is sniffing around, Kane grumbled. Reporters are asking questions. People are talking. Rogers swallowed. But you told me. I told you we'd handle it, Kane snapped. And we will. But you need to make sure everyone's on the same page. Understand? Rogers nodded slowly. Go talk to the neighbors, Kane said. They're the ones who saw the arrest. Make sure they didn't misunderstand what happened. Misunderstand. That was Kane's favorite word for lie. Rogers left the office with a sick feeling in his stomach. But Kane expected him to fix this, and Rogers needed Kane, so he went. The first knock. His first stop was Harold Whitman's house. Whitman lived 3 doors down from Judge Walker, a retired executive who proudly defended neighborhood standards. Whitman was the kind of man who believed justice meant comfort, his comfort. He opened the door with a smug smile when Rogers arrived. Morning, Officer Rogers, Whitman said warmly. Heard you had another situation on Maple Ridge. Rogers forced a grin. Just tying up loose ends. You saw what happened, right? That guy was being aggressive. Wouldn't comply. Whitman nodded eagerly. Oh, absolutely. I knew he was trouble the second I saw him. You handled it. Rogers' shoulders relaxed. One witness secured. But the next house on his list? That one wouldn't be so simple. The house where courage lived. Emily Carter stood frozen when she saw Rogers through the peephole. Her stomach knotted instantly. Her hands turned cold. She knew he might come. Grace Chen had prepared her for this moment. If he shows up, Grace said, don't challenge him. Don't argue. Don't try to be brave by confronting him. Your job is to survive the conversation and get the evidence. Grace had placed a small keychain recorder in Emily's palm earlier that day. Click this once before you open the door. Everything he says will be recorded. You're doing something dangerous, but you're also doing something necessary. And now here he was, standing on her doorstep, the man who pressed a gun to an innocent man's head. Emily's hands trembled violently, but she pressed the button. A tiny red light blinked. Recording. Her breath shook as she opened the door. Officer Rogers, she whispered. His smile was warm, too warm, like a sun lamp masking frost. Afternoon, Emily. Just checking in. Wanted to make sure you were okay after all that excitement the other day. He leaned on her door frame, blocking any attempt to close the door. She didn't speak. He continued, voice dripping with false sympathy. Look, I hate that you had to witness that. Really do. But that man, he lowered his voice, was dangerous. And now he's trying to ruin my life by making false accusations. Emily stared at him, her pulse thundering. Her fingers tightened around the keychain. He continued, so I just need you to confirm what you saw, that he was resisting, acting aggressive, that I handled things appropriately. It's just a simple statement. Emily swallowed. I didn't see everything. I was scared. You saw enough, Rogers insisted, leaning closer. You saw him raising his voice, right? You saw how he was being difficult? Emily's lips parted, but words wouldn't come out. Rogers' expression shifted. The smile faded. Something colder bloomed in its place. Emily, he said softly, we're neighbors. We live in this community together. We look out for each other. His eyes narrowed. You wouldn't want things to get uncomfortable around here, would you? Her heart stopped. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat. He continued, voice dropping lower. Accidents happen. Traffic tickets. Slower response times when you call 911. I'd hate for something like that to affect your family. Emily's breath hitched. And let's be honest, he went on. People like him. He jerked his thumb toward Judge Walker's house. They only understand one thing. Consequences. Someone has to teach them the rules. People like him. The phrase hit Emily with unexpected force. She wasn't black. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't know what it felt like to endure that kind of hatred firsthand. But in that moment, she understood something important. Hate doesn't limit itself. It spreads, it grows, it devours whoever is closest. If this man could threaten her so calmly, so confidently, what had he done to people who had no one watching? Her voice shook as she whispered, "Oh, okay. I'll tell them what you said. Just, please go." Roger smiled again. "That's all I needed, Emily. You're a good neighbor." And he walked away feeling victorious. Emily closed the door the second he disappeared. She slid down against it, shaking uncontrollably. Then she clicked off the recorder and sobbed. Not out of fear alone, but out of rage, because she had seen something pure and cruel. A man convinced he was untouchable. A man who believed he could reshape the truth with intimidation alone. And she knew, without question, that she had done the right thing. Across town, the recorder's live feed transmitted everything straight to Darius Reed, Judge Walker's investigator. He listened through his secure earpiece, his expression tightening. When the last word played, he stood and approached Judge Walker. "We got him," Darius said. "Everything. Intimidation, threats, admission of a corrupt culture, all in his own voice." Judge Walker closed his eyes for a long moment. His breath steadied, his shoulders lifted. A quiet, heavy gratitude settled over him. Emily Carter had not merely recorded a conversation. She had cracked the first wall in a fortress of corruption. The strike back in Judge Walker's study, plans shifted in real time. "Grace," Judge Walker said, "release the video." Grace nodded. "I'll publish it in 2 hours." "Lisa," he continued, "file the legal motions. Request federal involvement." "It's already underway," Lisa said, typing quickly. "Darius," he said softly, "send the audio to the FBI. Every second of it." Darius's eyes sharpened. "They won't be able to bury this one." Judge Walker looked around the room, the people who had stepped up when others stepped back, and felt something deep in his chest. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Hope. Because justice is not an idea, not abstract, not distant. Justice is the moment ordinary people do extraordinary things simply because it is right. Emily Carter pressing record. Jason Wells whispering a warning. A judge refusing to bow his head. These were the sparks. Now came the flames, the sound of collapse. That evening, at exactly 6 p.m., Grace Chen's article went live. The headline exploded across screens. Shock video. Chief Justice held at gunpoint by Lakewood officer. Within minutes, the internet ignited. Millions watched the video. Millions saw the gun at Anthony Walker's head. The insults, the threats, the humiliation, the brutality. Then came the second article. Exclusive audio. Officer Rogers threatens witness. Admits off-the-books culture. The recordings hit harder than any punch, harder than any headline. It was Rogers' voice, undeniable, arrogant, exposed. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a confession that would topple the empire he thought would protect him. The moral pulse of the moment. Judge Walker watched the news coverage from his study. He didn't smile, he didn't celebrate, he didn't feel vindictive joy. Instead, he felt something deeper, a sense of responsibility. Because this moment, this reckoning, wasn't about revenge. It was about the kind of America people say they believe in. An America where the truth matters more than comfort, where neighbors protect one another, where courage is contagious. He whispered to himself, "We're not done yet." Because justice isn't a storm, it's a sunrise. And the first rays had just broken the horizon. America is watching the story broke, like lightning splitting a quiet sky. At exactly 6 p.m., the first video went live. A crystal-clear recording of a black homeowner in an embroidered silk shirt standing peacefully in his own yard as a police officer approached him with suspicion and scorn. Millions of viewers watched in stunned silence as the tension escalated. They heard the officer's insults. They watched him press a gun to the man's head. They watched the arrest, the humiliation, the cruelty. Then came the second wave, the audio. Officer Mark Rogers threatening a woman, whispering about slow 911 response times, admitting to an off-the-books culture, suggesting that certain people needed to be taught the rules. The moment the recordings hit the internet, America inhaled sharply and did not exhale. Grace Chen's reporting was precise, devastating, and morally unflinching. She laid out the story with a clarity that didn't need embellishment. The truth alone was dramatic enough. Within 30 minutes, the video had 2 million views. Within an hour, 7 million. By midnight, it had crossed 20 million. Hashtags surged across social media. Mraka justice for Walker, Joen police bias, Nasashi truth matters. We're watching cable news picked up the story by 7 p.m. By 7:30, national outlets had dispatched reporters to the quiet suburb of Lakewood Heights. By 8:30, protesters gathered outside the precinct. Candles flickered alongside handmade signs. No more silence. Neighbors for justice. Accountability now. Some came because they had seen injustice too many times. Some came because they believed this time would be different. Some came because they realized that if a chief justice could be brutalized in his own yard, then no one was truly safe from the misuse of power. America was awake now, and it refused to look away. Inside the officer's world as it collapsed. Meanwhile, in the dim back room of Murphy's Bar, a known hangout for off-duty Lakewood officers, Mark Rogers sat hunched over a warm beer, his leg bouncing uncontrollably beneath the table. He watched the video on his phone, face draining of color. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He replayed the footage again and again, each time hoping the camera angle would magically shift, his voice would distort, the gun wouldn't look so deliberate. But cameras do not lie, not when pointed at the truth. Across from him, Chief Kane slammed his fist on the table. "She had a camera?" he barked. "A damn housewife had a camera on us the whole time?" Rogers barely heard him. His mind was imploding. He can't prove it's me," Rogers insisted weakly. "It's grainy. Could be anyone." Kane stared at him, stunned by the stupidity of the statement. "Mark," Kane said slowly, "you threatened a witness on tape? Your voice is clear as glass. Your face is on video, and the entire country is downloading it." Rogers felt bile rise in his throat. This can't be happening. But it was happening. It was unstoppable. Their actions had become a national spectacle, a symbol of everything America feared about its justice system. Kane looked at his phone again, his face going a mottled shade of red as more headlines flashed. Federal investigation underway. Lakewood PD accused of systemic abuses. Deputy AG calls for immediate resignations. Kane wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "We need a plan," he muttered. "We need a—" The TV above the bar cut him off. Breaking news flashed across the screen. A reporter stood outside the Lakewood precinct, crowd swelling behind her. "We have confirmed," she said, "that the FBI is reviewing the recordings and preparing for possible intervention." The bar went silent. Even the clink of glasses stopped. In that moment, Rogers understood something for the first time in his career. His badge could not save him. His chief could not protect him. His lies could not shield him. And his power, the power he had misused, abused, and taken for granted, was crumbling beneath him like rotting wood. He sank back in his chair, face ghost pale. What do we do?" he whispered. Kane didn't answer, because for the first time he didn't know. Back in the Walker household, Judge Anthony Walker watched the coverage from his study. The video played again and again on every channel, each replay a reminder of the violence he had endured, but also of the truth finally coming to light. His heart was heavy, but not in the way it had been during the arrest. This weight carried purpose. Lisa Chen, Deputy Attorney General, sat across from him, her phone buzzing nonstop as messages, updates, and alerts flooded in. "Justice Walker," she said softly, "you need to prepare yourself. This is about to become one of the biggest cases in the state's history." Anthony nodded. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about what this reveals." Lisa smiled faintly. "Exactly." Grace Chen looked up from her laptop. "Emily Carter agreed to go on record if necessary," she said. "She's terrified, but she said she wants to do what's right." A warmth filled Anthony's chest. Unexpected, gentle, humbling. Courage comes in many forms. But some kinds of courage can only come from ordinary people who finally decide they've seen enough. Protect her at all costs, Anthony said. She is the reason the truth is alive. Grace nodded. We will. The streets speak. By the next morning, Lakewood Heights was unrecognizable. News vans lined the streets. Helicopters hovered overhead. Protesters marched through downtown with chants that echoed through the city. Justice for all. Hold them accountable. No more hiding. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Elders marched with walking canes. Clergy members held signs alongside students. It wasn't chaos. It was clarity. America wasn't angry without direction. It was angry with purpose. For once, a nation divided by opinions was united by evidence. There was no ambiguity, no different angle, no conflicting story. The truth was unedited, raw, visible, public, and America responded not just with outrage, but with something more powerful, conviction. The federal arrival. At 10:00 a.m., a convoy of black SUVs rolled into Lakewood. The emblem on the doors, FBI agents, stepped out in tactical vests, their movements sharp and synchronized. They didn't arrive politely. They didn't request permission. They arrived with warrants. Inside the precinct, officers stared as federal agents poured through the entrance, fanning out with purpose. Chief Kane stumbled out of his office. "What is this?" he demanded. "Who authorized?" A lead agent stepped forward. "Chief Robert Kane," he said sternly, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under color of law." Kane froze. His mouth opened. No sound emerged. The agent continued. "You have the right to remain silent." Kane didn't fight, couldn't fight. The system he thought he controlled was now swallowing him whole. As they cuffed him, other officers watched, not with loyalty, but with relief, because his fall meant their fear could finally end. Agents retrieved hard drives, files, storage devices, personnel records, evidence logs, anything that could reveal patterns of abuse. Nothing was spared. Every action was efficient. Every search was purposeful. The message was unmistakable. The era of silence was over. The fall of Mark Rogers. The FBI found Rogers at home, shoving clothes into a suitcase. His wife stood in the doorway, pale and trembling. The moment Rogers saw the agents, his legs gave out. "Mark Rogers," the lead agent said, "you are under arrest for federal civil rights violations, witness intimidation, falsification of records, and aggravated assault." His wife gasped. His children, confused, clung to her legs. Rogers tried to speak, something between a plea and a denial, but the words tangled in his throat. His hands shook as the cuffs snapped around his wrists, and for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. Not because he was innocent, but because accountability had finally come for him. A Nation Reflects by sunset, the image of Rogers and Kane being led into separate black SUVs was broadcast on every major network. People gathered in living rooms across the country. Some watched in silence, some cried, some cheered, some simply nodded, because the story was no longer just about Lakewood Heights. It was about America's long and painful struggle with justice, with truth, with equality, with the question of who gets to feel safe and who doesn't. This case had become a mirror that showed not just problems, but possibilities, not just failures, but the courage needed to overcome them. For every person watching, it wasn't just a headline, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that the fight for justice isn't just fought in courts or police stations or city halls. It's fought in neighborhoods, on sidewalks, in quiet moments when someone chooses courage over comfort. Judge Walker's reflection. That evening, Judge Anthony Walker sat in his study alone, the news still looping on the muted television. His silk shirt was gone. His bruises were fading. His dignity was intact. And yet, he felt the weight of the journey ahead. Justice wasn't finished, not by a long shot. He stared at the Japanese maple through the window, its leaves shimmering softly in the breeze. Yesterday morning, he had admired it with pride. Now he admired it with understanding. He whispered, "This is how change begins, one truth at a time." He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, not in relief, but in resolution, because America had watched. And now America had to learn. Judgment and a stronger America. The courtroom was full, so full that the air felt heavy with breath, tension, and a collective anticipation that seemed to vibrate through the wooden benches. Reporters from every major network sat with cameras ready. Community members lined the aisles. Protesters filled the hallways. Officers, attorneys, students, parents, people from all corners of life had gathered for one historic moment, the sentencing of former officer Mark Rogers. It had been months since the incident, months since a gun was pressed to Chief Justice Anthony Walker's head, months since lies were exposed, corruption uprooted, and silence broken. Now the world waited for the final act. At the front of the room, the court officer stood tall and commanded, "All rise." The side door opened. The figure who emerged wore the long black robes of judicial authority, robes that seemed to carry centuries of history and responsibility. His presence alone drew a hush over the room. Chief Justice Anthony Walker took the bench. Former officer Mark Rogers looked up and his breath caught. His face paled. His knees nearly buckled. The shock was so complete, it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. He had assumed another judge, some distant, uninvolved figure, would handle his sentencing. He had never imagined that the man he humiliated, handcuffed, and dragged through the dirt would be the one deciding his fate. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Grace Chen scribbled urgently in her notebook. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail. Judge Walker adjusted his glasses, looked over the courtroom, and spoke in a voice that resonated with calm authority. "Please be seated." The room settled, but no one truly relaxed. This was bigger than one man, bigger than one officer, bigger than one act of hatred. This was a verdict on a system, on a culture, on the idea of justice itself, and America was watching. The judge speaks. Judge Walker opened the case file before him. He did not look at Rogers immediately. Instead, he read aloud the charges, his tone steady, deliberate, unwavering. "Mark Rogers, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of federal civil rights violations, aggravated assault, falsification of official records, and witness intimidation." Each word landed like a weight on Rogers' shoulders. Judge Walker continued, "This court acknowledges the overwhelming evidence presented. Video recordings, audio recordings, testimony from your fellow officers, testimony from the community, and your own actions, which were displayed for the world to see." Only then did Judge Walker lift his eyes and look directly at Rogers. The silence that followed felt sacred. "Mr. Rogers," he began, "you stood on my lawn that morning with a badge, a gun, and a belief that your authority placed you above accountability. You saw a black man in a quiet neighborhood and decided he did not belong, not because of anything he did, but because of who he was." Rogers swallowed, trembling. "You mocked me. You insulted me. You threatened my life. You paraded me before my neighbors as if I were not a man, not a homeowner, not a citizen, but a criminal." He paused, letting the words settle, letting them bruise. "That day, you were not enforcing the law. You were breaking it. You were not protecting your community. You were terrorizing it." Judge Walker leaned forward slightly, not with anger, but with moral weight. "You believed you were the law." His voice rose, not with rage, but with clarity. "But the law does not wield a gun. The law does not sneer. The law does not degrade. The law does not fear the truth." He held Rogers' gaze unblinking. "A policeman is not the law. He is its servant." A gasp rippled across the gallery. Judge Walker continued, "You used your badge to intimidate. You used your authority to silence. You abused every ounce of trust the public placed in you. Your actions did not represent a moment of poor judgment. They represented a pattern of cruelty, bias, and contempt for the very citizens you swore to protect." Rogers began to cry, not loud but broken. "You did not simply assault a man," Judge Walker said softly. "You assaulted our democracy. You assaulted the principle that all people, regardless of color, creed, or circumstance, are equal under the law." The courtroom was still. Many had tears in their eyes, because this was not revenge. This was justice speaking. The sentenced Judge Walker looked down at the papers before him. When he lifted his eyes again, The gravity in them made the room shrink around him. "For your crimes," he said, "and for the irreparable damage you have inflicted upon public trust, this court sentences you to the maximum term allowed by federal law, 15 years in a federal penitentiary." A quiet sob escaped Rogers. Judge Walker delivered the final blow with calm finality. "This sentence is not given in anger. It is given in hope. Hope that this nation will learn that authority without accountability is tyranny, that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and that every citizen, no matter who they are, deserves dignity." He lifted the gavel. "Let this serve as a reminder that justice still stands." Crack. The sound echoed like thunder. Mark Rogers collapsed into his chair, sobbing, his orange jumpsuit glaring under the courtroom lights. Federal marshals stepped forward to escort him out. He did not look back. He knew. Everything he believed protected him. Every lie, every abuse, every ounce of power had finally met a force stronger than fear. Truth. A neighborhood transformed. Months later, on a crisp autumn morning, the neighborhood of Lakewood Heights looked very different. The fear that had once lingered behind curtains had dissolved. Children played freely. Neighbors chatted easily across yards. The quiet was no longer the quiet of avoidance. It was the quiet of peace. Mrs. Whitman had moved out shortly after the scandal. The weight of the public shame had been too much. A young interracial family moved into her house, a sign perhaps of a kinder future. Across the street, Emily Carter stepped out onto her porch as Judge Walker emerged from his front door. He wore a deep blue silk shirt embroidered with silver cranes, another expression of dignity reclaimed. "Morning, Judge Walker," Emily called out with a bright smile. "Good morning, Emily," he replied warmly. Their children now played together, laughing across lawns where tension once lived. Emily approached the fence, hands in her pockets. "I still think about that day," she said softly. "I still think about how close it came." Judge Walker nodded. "So do I," he said. "But I also think about how quickly everything changed because you chose to act." Emily's eyes dropped. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Courage," he said gently, "is not the absence of fear. It is doing what is right despite it." She swallowed hard, grateful for the words. Reflection. Later that morning, Judge Walker stood in his yard with a warm mug of coffee, gazing at the Japanese maple he had planted months earlier. Its burgundy leaves shimmered in the sunlight, vibrant and full, proof that even after storms, life can flourish. He took a deep breath and felt something settle inside him. Not triumph, not pride, peace, because justice had been served, not perfectly, but meaningfully, because people had chosen courage over silence, because a community had learned compassion, because America, for once, listened. He knew the work was not done. Racism did not vanish with one sentence. Corruption did not evaporate with one arrest. But something had shifted. A door had opened, a light had entered, a seed had been planted. And seeds, when tended with love and vigilance, grow into forests strong enough to protect generations. A stronger America. Judge Walker looked out at the street, his street. He saw neighbors from every background talking openly. He saw children forming friendships once impossible. He saw a community healing, not through denial, but through recognition and accountability. And he thought of the lesson he wished the world would hold on to, that America is not weakened when we confront injustice. It is strengthened. That diversity is not a threat. It is a gift. That compassion is not weakness. It is courage. That love is not naive. It is necessary. That when we stand together, truly together, we build a nation worthy of every child's dreams. He whispered into the crisp morning air, "This is the America we must build, one act of courage at a time." When this story began, it was about a gun, a lawn, a man judged before he even spoke a word. But now, as we reach the end, it becomes something much bigger, something deeper, something every one of us must carry forward. Because beneath the violence, the humiliation, the heartbreak, there is a truth America can no longer ignore. Racism isn't just an act, it's a system, and it survives only when good people stay silent. But today we saw what happens when someone refuses to bow, when a neighbor presses record, when an officer dares to whisper the truth, when a community demands accountability, when justice finally stands up, unshaken. This wasn't just the fall of two corrupt officers. It was the rise of something better. The reminder that every one of us has a role in shaping this nation. A stronger America isn't built by perfect people. It's built by people willing to do the right thing, even when it terrifies them. It's built by neighbors who protect each other, by citizens who speak out, by communities who refuse to accept cruelty as normal. Inanna by hearts that choose love over fear and truth over silence. And if this story moved you, if it lit something inside you, then carry that forward. Love louder, stand stronger, help one another, reject hate wherever it hides. Because the future of this country isn't written by systems, it's written by people, by you, by us, by all of us choosing courage over comfort, connection over division, compassion over indifference. This is the America we deserve. This is the America we can build. And this is the America we must fight for, together. If this story resonated with you, if it opened your eyes, touched your heart, or reminded you of the power you carry, subscribe to the Racist Reality channel so you never miss another story that exposes truth, uplifts voices, and strengthens our shared humanity. And when you're ready to keep learning, feeling, growing, visit the channel and watch more videos. Every view, every comment, every share helps us shine a brighter light on the injustice so many still face. Thank you for listening. Thank you for feeling. And thank you for choosing love. This is Racist Reality, and together, we make reality better.